Hello and welcome to episode 137 of My Circus, My Monkeys. In a recent coaching session, I was asked, this younger generation seems to bring all their emotions to work with them, and I'm a Gen Xer, and this is not the norm for me. How am I supposed to handle all of these emotions? Well, we had a great discussion, and so I wanted to share some highlights so that you too could know how to better handle it when folks come to you with lots of emotions. So keep listening. I've done previous episodes on emotions, but I've also continued to grow and learn about how emotions work. So today, I want to approach the topic in perhaps a different way than I have in the past. That being said, don't be surprised if you hear some overlap from previous episodes. Okay, so to start us off, let's dig into this notion of professionalism versus emotions. I would say most folks, especially from older generations, would say that expressing strong emotions at work is quote unquote unprofessional. And I would agree that if you have someone who repeatedly has tantrums or breaks down at work because of these emotions, that is indeed problematic. But I think more often than not, we deem them unprofessional because they make us uncomfortable. And that discomfort often comes from the fact that, oh, so many of us don't know much about emotions, including how to process them in a healthy way. I mean, if Chris comes in and asks you a question about how to do a report, you can easily and comfortably answer that question, most likely. But if Chris comes in and is upset about the report in some way, that is way more challenging to navigate. Now, I mentioned this idea of professionalism because it feeds into the stories, aka beliefs, that you may have about your role in this situation. And if you believe emotions don't belong in the workplace other than happy ones or thoroughly fleshed out ones that are neatly tied up with the supporting PowerPoint presentation, then you're going to immediately default to thinking to Chris is not being professional. They need to stop interrupting me, get themselves together, and get back to work. And when that is your story, your priority shifts from solving whatever's going on to getting Chris the bleep out of your office as quickly as possible. And you may feel empathy for Chris or even feel like you're listening to their concerns. But again, if that's your story on some level, if that's your story, or you're just so uncomfortable with emotions, on some level, even if you're listening, you're really just focusing on how you can make this stop for you. And how are you going to make this stop? Well, there are many ways. Some are healthy and adaptive, and others not so much. So let's dig into emotions and what to do when they pop up at work. So I think I said this in previous episodes, but no matter how rational you may think you are and how much you don't like dealing with emotions, emotions guide almost all of your decisions. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, first discovered this when he was looking at patients who had brain damage to the emotional center of their brain. And he saw these folks struggle to make even the most basic decisions, like what to have for dinner. And that was because they couldn't feel, therefore, they couldn't decide. So let's break that down a bit. I like Fords, but not Chevys. And this isn't like a truck thing. And it's not even anything that actually comes up much in my life. My parents had one or two Ford vehicles growing up and a couple others, but not a Chevy. And my car is 24 years old, thanks to the low mileage I got from living on campus so long. And when I think about what I might like to drive next, there is zero chance of me getting a Chevy. If I think about Ford, I feel good about it. And that is a viable option for me. But even if I just think, maybe I should just see what Chevy has, I immediately shut it down. My brain, my body goes, ugh, but Chevy sucks. So why would I ever do that? And you may be asking, why do I hate Chevy so much? I honestly don't know. There is 100% no rational reason for this. I don't know much about cars in general, so it's certainly not backed by all the data about performance or anything like that. And honestly, even knowing that my dislike of Chevys is completely arbitrary, if I still ask my brain, that is irrational. If I still ask myself again that question, I still do not want a Chevy. And simply put, Fords feel good to me, Chevys feel bad. So what is my deal? Well, in my formative years, my brain simply categorized these things in a way based on my limited experiences, including things like commercials I saw, comments people made, things like that, and none of which I actively remember. But now it colors my feelings about the issue and thus my decisions around it. In other words, I have a story around Fords and a story around Chevys that impacts how I feel about them and thus impacts my potential decisions around them. Now, we've talked about stories in past episodes, including how we should identify the ones that aren't serving us and upgrade them. Now, this story doesn't really get in my way, so I have no vested interest in spending the time or the energy to challenge it. I mean, sure, if somebody came and said, "Hey, I have a Chevy. Do you want it? It's free." Yeah, sure, I would probably try and get over that. But otherwise, I can just get a Ford or get a car from another company that I don't have such strong feelings about. And again, I'm just walking you through this to illustrate how emotions come into decision making. So take a minute and think about something in your life that you feel strongly about, but if you're honest, you don't really know why it seems or feels so important. Maybe it's around something as mundane as the types of food that you prefer or your favorite color. Or maybe it's related to something at work, like how your students or your staff should behave. We are filled with these stories and thus feelings about everything around us and don't even realize it. And yet, these emotions impact your decisions and your actions, and impacts the decisions and actions of the people around you, including your team members. So think about your favorite color. Objectively, what criteria should one use to select a favorite color? I mean, yes, they have study colors and certain colors bring out certain properties or feelings in people, but unless you're trying to scientifically select one of those, there really isn't any criteria to use for a favorite color. We like blue or green or Chevys or Fords because of how they make us feel. That's it. Our emotions are behind our decisions to select yellow as our favorite color and our decision to have a sandwich for lunch versus a salad. And if they're in play for those things, they're absolutely going to show up at work. I mean, how do you decide what project to work on? Sure, maybe you use a pro and con list, but even doing that makes you feel a certain way. And what of the results of our pro and con list? If there are 5 things on the pro list and 3 things on the con list, you do the math and feel satisfied, happy, relieved, whatever, that the pros have it. But what if it's an even split? What if it's a 3-to-3 pro to con situation? How do you decide then? That's right. It's still based on how you feel about those options. Emotions are the fuel that propels you into action. And some folks describe this by saying emotion stands for energy in motion, or E hyphen motion. In a nutshell, it's our emotions that push us one way versus another. And yes, you can have conflicting emotions around something that keep you stuck. Emotions are simply tools to help guide us as to what comes next. They alert us that, hey, something's going on here that we need to pay attention to. And just like with our talents, our emotions can be positive and tell us, yes, this is awesome. We need to do more of this. Or they can be negative and alert us to potential issues that we need to resolve. But the emotions themselves aren't the message. It's what is behind those emotions that is important. You don't follow the emotion. You use it to understand what you need to do next to resolve the issue. Here's an example of something I encountered recently. My dog is older and has some health issues, including kidney disease. And I was scrolling on Facebook And someone in one of the pet groups mentioned that their dog was in stage 3 kidney disease and was having all these health issues. Well, my dog was recently diagnosed as moving into stage 3, but she also doesn't actually show any external symptoms of it. Yet, I could feel myself getting very anxious and going into fight or flight. Now, rationally, I told myself, that is not my dog. I have no idea what other issues that dog has that's impacting her. My dog just went on a walk with me this morning and is doing great, all things considered. Again, rationally, I knew that was true, but just saying that to get the feeling to go away would be ignoring my emotions. And ignoring our feelings actually ends up causing more problems, even though in the moment, it seems to make you feel better. Well, my brain was actually trying to help me avoid the same fate as this dog in the post. It was saying, hey, what else can we do to keep Sweet D healthy? Wasn't there something else you were going to do for her? And in fact, there was. When I got the stage 3 diagnosis earlier this summer, I researched nutritionists who did one-on-one consultations, and I knew who I wanted to work with. But at the same time, I'd started her on some supplements to help support her kidneys. So I kind of felt like, to some degree, that box was checked. And while this was going on, my parents' car completely died. And since I live with them, it became this stressful situation because everybody was sharing my vehicle, plus they were looking for one and all of that jazz. So all of that stress put my plans to contact the nutritionist on the back burner. So my fear and anxiety that popped up from that post was actually my brain reminding me that there were some other things I was going to do to support my dog. Once I thanked my brain and worked through what the actual message was, I could do what I needed to do and let that emotion go. And I booked that appointment the next day. When you're dealing with intense emotions at work, and this is true for yourself, your team, and your students, the same formula is in play. Something triggers that emotion, but it's not the emotion itself that is important. It is the underlying message. Say you're in a staff meeting and one of your team members questions a decision that you or the institution made. You might feel defensive or embarrassed or angry. When that happens, it's easy to follow the emotion and direct that anger toward the person. Or, again, if you're feeling defensive or maybe embarrassed, just start apologizing profusely. This process will be, of course, reinforced by any stories that you have about the supervisor/employee relationship, or even your abilities as a supervisor. Like maybe you think employees shouldn't question superiors at all, or at least not in front of others. But we're often so busy following our emotions or trying to shove them down that we don't ask what the underlying message is. If this situation made you to feel defensive, ask yourself why. Is it because you knew it wouldn't work, but you didn't voice your opinion in the meeting where it was decided? Or maybe you don't feel confident in your role as a supervisor, so you interpreted questioning the decision as questioning your leadership abilities. Either way, this gives you information about what you can do next to prevent this from happening in the future. Maybe your brain is saying, I think it's time we learn to be more assertive so we can feel more comfortable expressing our opinions to administration. Or maybe your brain is helping you realize, hey, I don't feel super confident in my role as a supervisor. I need to develop my knowledge and skills around supervising so I better understand my role and feel more confident. Those negative emotions can feel very heavy and unpleasant. But according to neurologist Dr. Jill Boltz Taylor, emotions themselves only last 90 seconds. During that time, the body goes through a chemical process to alert you to your brain's interpretation of a situation. In other words, you have a thought and your brain kicks out whatever hormones are responsible for you feeling that way. And after they rush through your body, they should dissipate. They've alerted you to the situation, so technically, their job is done. But we often feel like emotions last longer than that because they can trigger our stories and past emotions. And that's often when we get stuck ruminating on past experiences and or the emotions that go along with them. So in other words, what we think is our emotional response to the thing happening right now is really our reaction to things that happened in the past. And again, that's our brain saying, hey, I think we need to get this resolved. So instead of trying to push your emotions away or getting swept up in them, practice sitting with those emotions for the 90 seconds. Then thank your brain for trying to help you. After that, shift your focus to find the root of that feeling. Why did you feel mad, sad, anxious, defensive, etc.? It might be what's happening now, but is your reaction proportional to the actual situation, or is it so strong because it's connected to stories and past experiences? It's important to know. So let's go back to my example of you getting angry because someone questioned a decision you made. It might very well be tempting to say the root cause of your anger is Frank, because Frank was being unprofessional in a staff meeting. And even if you're right, even if Frank was being a bleep, the real question is, what do you need to do differently to prevent this from happening again? And maybe it's that you need to have a conversation with Frank about his overall performance or his comments in the meeting. Or maybe you need to set clear expectations with your whole team. It could even be a message that you're so stressed, you can't properly regulate your emotions and that you need a break. Whatever the underlying cause is, the feeling is letting you know something important about the situation. Often, our stories and feelings about things are driven by our talent themes. I have ideation as my number one. So when I get an idea, I'm usually super psyched about it and want to immediately stop what I'm doing so I can start on it. And as with all talent themes, this can be incredibly valuable if it's helping me get things done. But if I'm trying to finish another project, this can show up as a weakness for me. In the moment, my emotions can take over and try and push me to drop what I'm working on, that important thing, to work on my new idea. But if I can stop and reflect and say, this is ideation, getting excited about blank, then I can choose to lean into my other talent themes to redirect that energy, AKA emotions, into something that better suits my needs at the time. Now, I want to specifically talk about the talent theme empathy here. Empathy is all about connection to feelings, yours and the folks around you. And we often hear from people with empathy that they can easily get overwhelmed with all the emotions around them. And it can be really easy for people with empathy to not just feel how others are feeling, but also take that feeling and the associated situations on for themselves. So when someone comes in and is upset about their roommate or a failing class, a person with empathy might psychologically take on that problem as their own. My sister is a trauma therapist who has empathy, and early in her career, this would happen to her. And it can leave you feeling exhausted and overwhelmed. But since now you have a better understanding of the function of emotions, you can see why this doesn't work. If I have empathy and I take on your emotions of anxiousness or sadness, then suddenly I'm anxious or sad, but with no feasible way to get to the underlying message of that emotion because I don't have the context of all your past experiences. Now, you can help that person to uncover the root of their emotion so they can work through it. That would be helpful. But simply being anxious with someone is a complete waste of your energy because it literally helps no one and harms you. This is why understanding and developing your own talent themes is so important, and helping your team understand theirs. Again, our stories and feelings are often attached to our strengths and impact how they show up. And if we aren't aware of what they're doing and how they're making us feel, we can get swept away by them, and they'll impact our decisions in less than optimal ways. When you take the time to understand your talent themes and take the time to help your team understand theirs, you can develop the right knowledge and skills to keep them operating as strengths instead of weaknesses. For example, folks with empathy often have issues setting healthy boundaries. And that's why it's so easy for them to take on others' emotions and problems. And if you have empathy, start paying attention to your emotions and the messages they're giving you. They might be saying, this is too much. I'm exhausted and can't handle anymore. Then take the energy those emotions are giving you. Again, that concept of energy in motion or emotion, and use it to learn how to create and hold healthy boundaries. That is the best use of that energy. And if you're dealing with folks on your team who are having strong feelings about something, acknowledge those feelings. I can see that you're really upset, angry, frustrated by the situation. That's the first step. The next step is helping that individual reflect on why they're feeling that way and what they or possibly you can do to resolve that issue. And I'll just add here that sometimes this can be tricky. I mean, take folks working in DEI spaces these days. It's become fraught with political nonsense that can prevent people from doing what they were originally hired to do and things that they're passionate about. And it is natural that people will have some strong emotions around that. But dwelling on those emotions is not helpful for anyone. Yes, you should feel angry. Let's acknowledge that. But it's the next steps are what matter. And with something like diversity in this political landscape, you can't always decide to do the thing that would actually fix it. But that doesn't mean there's not something you can do to make it better. And your job is not to be a therapist here, but to help them understand, as Alicia likes to say, your feelings are real, but they aren't reality. The anger or frustration isn't the thing that needs to be fixed. Again, if they are true emotions, they should be gone in 90 seconds. The work that needs to be done is unpacking what that anger or frustration represents. Back to my example of someone questioning you about decisions in a meeting. But instead of looking at your reaction, let's look at what was behind Frank's question or questioning. Maybe Frank questioned the decision because he's angry that no one ever asked the folks on the ground for their input before these decisions are made. That anger is a warning that there might be problems with the work culture. So if you call out Frank and tell him how such comments are not appropriate or professional without getting to the root of the issue, you actually haven't solved anything. You've just reinforced the problem, which is that people in upper levels are ignoring the concerns of folks on the ground. Now, all that being said, sometimes folks can get caught up in what is known as emotional flooding. And emotional flooding happens when you experience one or multiple emotions so intensely that you literally just shut down. And when that happens, you or the person you're talking to literally cannot process or participate in any meaningful conversation. At this point, you or they are emotionally dysregulated. And if that's happening to you, the best thing you can do is leave the situation if possible and decompress. If it's happening to the team member or a student, again, you want to acknowledge their feelings, but there is literally no point in trying to discuss the situation then. They aren't going to be able to have a productive conversation. They're simply not, and nor would you be if you're the one who's emotionally dysregulated. It is better for everyone involved if you have them leave and decompress first. And you can absolutely call a timeout on your conversation and schedule it later, schedule a follow-up later once they have the opportunity to decompress and get their thoughts together. That is completely appropriate and is not you being a bad supervisor or kicking the can down the road, so to speak. That is the best thing to do in that situation. All right. So that was a lot of information about emotions. And this episode is going a bit longer than I anticipated, but I do want to wrap this up for you. Most of us never learn how to deal with emotions, both what they are, what to do with them, what to do with other people's emotions, etc. And that can make dealing with emotions feel very uncomfortable, especially at work. But in a nutshell, emotions are just biofeedback loops to help us identify when things are going well. So things like happiness, satisfaction, joy, and when there are potential problems in our environment. So things like fear, frustration, or anxiety. And when we or one of the folks we're working with has a strong emotion, one, acknowledge that emotion and write it out for those 90 seconds. Then, if it's happening to you, thank your brain for the message. And if it's happening for someone else, acknowledge their feelings and thank them for letting you know. Number 3, if you or the other individual seem to be emotionally dysregulated, AKA you're experiencing emotional flooding, You need to allow yourself or that team member time to decompress so you can actually become emotionally regulated and have a conversation. That is an important step. You can't skip it. Number 4, once everybody is regulated, start exploring the root cause of what this emotion was. Where did it come from? What triggered your brain to react in the first place? And remember, your brain / their brain is just trying to protect you. It's saying, hey, there's something you need to do to prevent blank from happening. So, at least for negative emotions, that is. Obviously, positive ones are like, ooh, let's do more. But once you know, or at least have a good idea about what the message was, figure out an action plan. So this is the last step, and it's super important because if you don't do this, you're just going to keep having the same emotion. You're still going to be triggered by those things because you're not doing anything to fix it. So once you know, or at least have a good idea what the message was, figure out your action plan. What do you or your team members need to do to prevent this from happening in the future? What's going to fix or at least change the underlying problem? Okay, so that was a lot about emotions. And even though I've broken this down, it's probably still going to feel weird addressing your other people's emotions through this framework. And again, very few of us are properly taught about how to engage with our emotions, much less others. So this can be uncomfortable, but keep at it. I've been working on getting more in touch with my feelings, my emotions for several years now. And the example I gave about my dog and the kidney disease, it just all came together so beautifully for me this past weekend. So it takes time to get used to this process, but if you do, you'll not only feel more comfortable working with emotions, your own and others, but you'll also be able to upgrade your life because emotions are actually the key to telling you what's working and what needs to change.